and as Sarah's final fringe event. And if you see sort of anyone doing cartwheels or jumping up and down, it's just some of the guys who've been stuck in this room for the last few days, working their butts off. So just don't be too surprised. But anyway, welcome and thank you very much to all of you who prioritised making this. I'm aware that we're competing with a number of major events. So what we will try and do is to make this as discursive as possible, because we need to learn from you. And I think, you know, by definition, and even better if my phone works, we can take it as read that by default, everyone in this room is committed to delivery on that zero carbon future. I think what we continually come back to is that is fine, but how's it going to be financed? How are we going to structure it? And importantly, I think, and again, where I'm particularly keen to welcome Simon, is I'm always told, oh, you know, the market won't bear that, the market really won't cope. And I'm always keen to say, well, what about my communities? Can we actually ask what the community is going to cope? So I particularly welcome Simon from Share Action with the commitment to people and planet, which is very vital. I'd like to welcome Ines Finn from Tideway, who, on a purely personal note, Tideway are doing a 25-kilometre sewage network of the Thames, having spent summer swimming in the Thames because I bought my boat there. I'm really glad when some of the sewage is sorted out, but in particular, we're here today to hear about the green bonds. And last but not least is my fellow senior colleague, Rishi Meghani, and Rishi chairs the Pensions Committee for Camden, and possibly knows a little bit about finance as head of finance and sustainable finance at Exchequer. So, fairly awesome panel, I think. What I'd quite like to do is to each, and I'll start with Ines and work our way down, to invite the panel to just really give their initial perspectives on how we are really going to fund and build the green recovery. Because again, I think if anyone sat in the conference hall, the tension really is, nobody believes, we say words just transition, but actually who's going to fund the jobs, where are the jobs going to go, how are we going to reach this great green recovery, and hopefully from this we can start to build some thinking and some options as to what CERA could be promoting across the party. So Ines, over to you first. Thank you.
So I'll tell you a little bit about Tideway, and then I'll talk about our funding model, and then finally about financing. So Tideway is addressing sustainability issues, created to address the sustainability issues in pollution and also biodiversity in the River Thames in London. And it's one of the large regions in the UK, one of the largest capital cities in Europe to address these issues. To do this. The solution 10 years looking at what could be done, and the solution eventually was this 25-kilometre tunnel, large 3 buses, and the design life of 120 years. And interesting, the tunnel was designed to withstand climate change, so modelling different climate scenarios until 2080, and also the population growth. And then finally, very important, we're not just building a tunnel, which is the construction aspect of it. Trying to do is reconnect London with the River Thames, and so we have committed from the very beginning to do a lot of other things, not just construction. So we have this 54 legacy commitment. I'm not going to talk much about it now, but they cover areas of jobs, environment, we work with our communities, and my colleagues are here as well, we have to talk to us so that we have done this there, and importantly, we raise financing on that. So, what to do? How do we fund a very large scale infrastructure project? Where does the money come from? Who pays for it? And especially with all the issues around the intergeneration of fairness. This tunnel will serve at least 6 generations, should it be the current generation going to pay for it? How do you do that? So the funding in this case is relatively straightforward, and it comes from Thames Water customers, the bill payers, and they will have about £20 a year added to their bills to fund time. It's not a lot, and especially Thames Water customer bills are still among, I think, the third lowest in the country. One of the reasons is because they haven't addressed this issue yet. We still have lost sewage on a weekly basis in London. And then we get to the risk profile. It's a very long, extended construction period, 8-year construction period, with a lot of risks, and going to $14 million, imagine the risks that create. But then at least 120, we hope, operational life, which would be a really boring asset, very stable, very predictable, and ideal for holders. How do you finance that? And so the solution that came to after quite a long time is we're a regulated entity, regulated by the water regulator. So we have a license that was made with several adaptations to address the needs of this project. And in addition, we have something that is of interest to people. So it's called this asset-based model, that we receive revenue based on the asset that we build. We have a government support package for catastrophic risk. And I think the thinking went as well. It would be very difficult to attract investment, either equity or debt in the private sector, if these catastrophic risks would be present. Imagine flood the tunnel, the tube network in London by just hitting one of the tunnels, which we haven't done and don't plan on doing. But there's that sort of catastrophic risk. And eventually, the government will have that risk. No private entity will take it. So if you already have that risk, you may as well put a contract around it, charge it, and by doing that, what it may enable the project to become investment grade, rated, investment grade for rating agencies, and then attracted both private equity and private debt. And the equity, we have as shareholders, represent about 3 million pension holders in the UK, and then more through our debt. The thing with pension holders is that this is our pensions, and it needs to be repaid, so we have to do it. So what we found that on the back of that, being a sustainability driven project, with the natural thing to do was to raise financing on a sustainable basis as well. So about 5 years ago, we started putting together our green financing package. We have now raised 17 green bonds. We've done some other private placements on a green basis. We also done sustainable loans that have been linked to those legacy elements that I mentioned earlier. So if we perform well, we get to pay less interest on our loans. And finally, I'll stop here, we've aligned all our legacy with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and we've been reporting on that basis to all our stakeholders.
So, you're very much linked to the long-term stability and simplicity of what was coming through.
Yes, absolutely. The risk is, let's get box the risk of construction, because it's very risky, but once it's built, it's ideal for pension funds. Low risk, low return, very predictable.
Okay, so we'll come.
I think only just struggling to hear a little bit now. I've followed you the through, but I'm wondering if the microphones could go slightly closer.
Absolutely.
It's very
interesting.
Way there. I don't know where people are moving around, but is that what I think a number of people are going to say?
Okay, thank you for that. Sorry, we're trying to keep ventilation going as well, which is okay. So it's supporting the short term to get the long term stability. Okay, Simon, people and planet.
People, planet, and the investment system. So thank you very much for having me here today. I'm part of the team at Share Action. We're an NGO that's been around for about 15 years, and we campaign for responsible investment. So we want to help transform the investment system so that we can live within safe ecological limits, as we've just been talking about, and simultaneously not undermine the social foundation of our communities. And I think I just wanted to sort of set out 3 thoughts at the beginning of this conversation. The first, from my perspective, is that when we're talking about green finance, what really matters is standards and accountability, and for green finance to work, that drive effective finance of the transition, like the EU, or whether it's content to take a rather more laissez-faire approach, rather like that that's being adopted in the US, and even the SEC now is just starting to get comfortable with requiring basic climate disclosures from issuers and from investors. So we're going to system ask it's not just about we also need to transition the rest of our economy away, and the financial system driving that transformation from dirty and harmful environmental industries. Many of our polluting industries are never going to qualify for the sort of finance that Ines has just been talking about, but we need them to transition. We need investment systems that's driving that transition, and that's frankly where we spend most of our time working, holding investors to account. There's been a proliferation of net zero commitments from the finance industry over recent months. In fact, not a week goes by when there's not a new net zero coalition or group that announces itself. But what we know is that despite this rhetoric, the action is sadly lacking still from the industry. And asset managers, for example, who have their net zero asset managers alliance, only 16% of those asset managers have policies that exclude coal finance. Only 35% of those asset managers have undertaken scenario analysis to understand the impact of climate change on their portfolios. So while we see investors getting comfortable with requiring climate disclosures, what we really need them to do is push much harder on whether those plans are actually being delivered within industry and being active owners. And we can maybe talk about some examples of that if we have time. But the final thing I wanted to end on, and I suppose this is my note of optimism, is that we know that savers don't want their savings to be destroying the planet. Nest pensions, established under the Labour government in 2006, with now some 10 million members and £10 billion worth of assets under management, is a particularly broad and diverse set of savers as a result of auto-enrolment. And they recently surveyed their members and found that 3/4 of them agreed that they wanted the scheme to be investing in a way that achieves not just a bigger pension, but also a better world. But the demand from savers is not being translated into action at the moment, as I've just been talking about. Perhaps it's because some pension schemes still adhere to a very narrow interpretation of fiduciary duty. We can talk about that if we have time. And we need to make progress there. So that's my note of optimism to end. That our money can change things, and that we know people want to do that if only the investment system will listen and respond.
Okay, some really valid points there, and in some ways reflecting a roundtable we had in here yesterday, where the leader of Barking Dagenham was saying that he has loads of companies, loads of investors always wanting to give him a product or a solution, but nobody actually wanting to fund the transition. How we could actually deal with the impact of automation as well as low carbon and move through. Having brought up, I'm never going to say this word correctly, now I've written it down, fiduciary duty, it's probably worth me handing over to you, Rishi, given your pension interests.
Brilliant, thanks Lisa. And thank you to you, Hardy Souls, who ventured through the Brighton storms today, and to those watching. So the next is tell you about what I'm doing. Some challenges we find, and a bit of action. I'm sorry, there's no free lunch. You're going to take some homework away with you. So back in 2014, I was first elected as a councillor, and because my day job's in finance, I leave finance and Westbrook this needs to lead to. I was kicking into the whip and trying to put me on the pension committee. So I do not want to go on pensions. It's too much like my day job. The last thing I want to do. Circumstances changed, and you have to do deals with whips, how it works in politics, and then you know if I want to be on the environment committee, I have to do pensions. So I ended up becoming vice chair of pension committee. I then became the chair that Christmas, through sad chair passed away suddenly, and suddenly I was responsible for £1.4 billion employees and current employees' lifetime savings. Now, it suddenly hit me that this is something I had to learn about very rapidly, and most chairs across the local government space are lay, they're not expert in this space. Now, Camden had a long history of engagement in pensions, so we've been involved in the tripartite model. We have one of the longest voting policies in the whole sector, 25 pages. I don't recommend reading it word for word, but if you're ever looking for some guidance on how to encourage your asset managers to vote on general board and things like that, definitely steal it, because I try to put so much in public domain. And I sort of looked at this differently, and I thought we were getting a lot of pressure from divest to understand how we benefit things, and I really wanted to sort of try and show some leadership in local government. So we started we did a strategy review of our fund, and we brought in sustainable development goals, and many of you in this room will be familiar with, and try to align everything we're doing in our pension fund along with 3 sustainable development goals. We chose climate action as the obvious one. We chose gender equality as a second one we thought was still shockingly behind decent jobs and growth, which is quite an apt this kind of green recovery. We then started to disclose to us all their ESG work along the standards of this and what they were doing in this. And what my biggest sort of worry has been the amount of greenwashing and ESG washing that is in the sector. The number of times I send back slides or tell my managers this is nonsense, and I've got beautiful slides that can be curated by McKinsey, but it's just trying to talk a wool over eyes when they're not actually taking enough action. People like Share Action are brilliant at holding a mirror up to some of this, and they're really, it's why I work so closely with Catherine and Simon's team, because actually they really have been instrumental in holding people to account. This market is really growing, and there are people trying to get us in this and tennis Taiwan sort of examples of this, where we can look at genuine, where the thought, I first met in as a green bond conference before it was cool. You know, now green gilt was issued obviously this last week. There's a lot of focus on this, but people, you know, there have been people who are trying to build this market because we want to have standards and taxonomies around this. So we are following similarly to the EU taxonomy and waiting for the UK taxonomy. I mean, in some ways, it's bloody embarrassing by my language that we're waiting now for a taxonomy that's still, you know, ahead of COP. We're the host of COP. How are we still waiting for government to be giving us a taxonomy around this to define green? My big worry, a real big worry, is how we make sure that we allocate our assets to make sure that this is any transition happens in a just way. So through Local Authority Pension Forum, we've been instigating an inquiry on just transition to ensure that pension fund managers are thinking about how do we make this most fair. So when I started my carbon footprinting at Camden, so we won an award for this 3-4 years ago because we were doing some innovative things. I get my managers to get in a room together and fight over carbon and to try and reduce carbon. And it won us an award because it was not, people hadn't thought about doing this before. So it sounds dark because it sounds very obvious now. Now, carbon accountants got better, but there was a big focus on divest on the fossil companies. But actually, when we looked at our pension fund at Camden, our biggest exposure was through cruise ships and cement. And actually, it really made me start thinking that our job is not just to divest fossil fuels and reducing that exposure is absolutely essential, but actually to decarbonise the whole economy. And how do we do that across every bit of infrastructure, from sewers to you know, across the piece? And we need every bit of infrastructure to be on a net zero target. And Simon alluded to it briefly. These net zero targets, we have to really, you know, this is our job actually to really interrogate them, make sure they're actually worth the paper they're printed on. And this is a genuine call to action for all of you to think about, you know, what's the biggest impact you can do on climate today? It's to look at your savings, either to look at your council, speak to your councillors, what are they doing with the, whatever the fund is. I mean, I'm now responsible for, this is really giving me great air because I'm now the Shell representative for 30 billion of London's pension funds. So I'm trying to amplify what we've done at Camden across London and also try and make it mainstream and make it the standard approach that climate's put first into London's pensions. But also think about your lifetime savings. We use so much jargon in this, and I happen to work in the finance sector in my day job. But actually, we make this so complicated. But actually, what pensions are very simple. It's your lifetime saving that you want to use up before you die. It's not complicated. It's the savings product. And why would we wrap it up in so much jargon? This makes it really hard for us to do decent things around aligning with environmental, social, and governance issues. So my call to action is for each of you to think about your savings, your pensions, where they are. Write to your local councillors, some of you may be local councillors here, ask what your fund are doing, and put pressure on, because together we can move the needle.
Thank you. Sorry, I've my selections tomorrow, so reselections, so I seem to have quite a few people ringing me. Okay, thank you very much for that, Bridget. And again, I think a really interesting point that we can get very caught up in that divest and fossil fuels, and certainly for the West Midlands region, it is the cement factory that is the most problematic. So, any initial perspectives from the audience at this point in time that they'd like to bring forward? Colleague over there.
So for a long time, my name's Eric Pilmore, I'm from Bracknell. It's a small town near Reading, about half an hour from London by train. For a long time, I've got a master's in environmental science, legislation and management from Brunel, and for a long time I've been interested in setting up a sort of green company, clean capital energy, to try and bring about some change within the domestic energy production market. I have a huge, like you're saying, slide saying who I could employ, how they would work in the company, how it all work together, and a great team, some really major tech players from Apple and all sorts. And time and again, what the response I get is we need more investment to really make it happen. Some of the people that I work with are on six-figure salaries, really happy in their jobs. That's changed for some of them because of COVID or whatever. They don't have contracts with the Bank of England and all these big places. They're looking for new outlets because of COVID. They're kind of poised to do these sorts of things, but I haven't been able to connect with someone that has 3 billion or 1 billion or even 1 billion to actually do something really radical with this brand or this company, because I think that's the sort of money that needs to be injected into these small solar domestic companies to actually get them off the ground, get chippies, electricians, sparkies or whatever doing their thing in domestic ways to get energy on people's roofs and turbines in the houses. I mean, it's a huge potential because the market is individualized. People get back what they pay for, and it might take time to recoup the costs, but at least they're in control of their energy. And big companies aren't just messing about with bills and things which are out of their control. It's very empowering to create your own energy. And I think it's been suffocated a lot because of the market. And COVID has brought this about. We want to be more independent. We want to be stronger individually to supply our own needs. It's like crofting back in the old days. But we need to be empowered by certain investors, people that have extreme amounts of money, pension pots or whatever, to put into these companies. Come by big business. We're not BP, we're not these huge companies. So yeah, I'm just saying I would like to get into contact with people that have enough money to invest in this sort of vehicle. I can't go around just looking for $1 million here, $1 million there from a random dragon or something like that.
Okay. So very much their investment in the SMEs, in the niche companies that are coming through. How do we actually create the bridge across? I'll take 2 more points from the floor. Gentleman over there.
Thank you. My name is Joe Hornby and I work for the Impact Investing Institute. So we sort of work to get more private capital working for public goods, and we've worked both with Rishi in his various roles as well as with Share Action. So very good to be here today. I wanted to ask about the social element to all of this. This is about how we fund a green recovery, and obviously the recovery part needs to sort of tackle some of the inequalities that have been exacerbated during COVID. I think it's very good to see the good response to the UK's green bonds last week, and we've worked with the government in terms of looking at how the government can report on the social impact of that green spending, but there's still more work to be done by bringing that social lens into those investment decisions in the first place. And it would be really good to hear the panel's thoughts on how to integrate social into green going forwards, both in the UK, EU and elsewhere. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. An absolutely critical point, and one that certainly has been consistent throughout this conference, that major challenge of the speed and scale of change balanced with the economic and social needs and actually ensuring that those come through. Any additional points? Nobody else dying for a question? Okay, colleagues. Sorry, gentleman in the corner there.
Kendrick Fowler, Blackpool, North and Cleveland's just been outside experiencing some climate change. On a serious note, my question is, I've just survived, but my question is, how do we make sure that our efforts to protect the environment don't exclude the needs of disabled people? Thanks.
The needs of disabled people. So how do we actually ensure that investment is actually open for you? Okay. I think it's very much up to you, colleagues, how much you answer on that or not. Certainly there's an interesting bridge.
Happy to go first, so that helps, just to get the ball rolling. So I think the access to capital for SMEs is absolutely key. I mean, I think it's 40% of our UK emissions are from SMEs, and actually, unless we help them to decarbonise, we're not going to meet the other net zero targets we have. So there's got to be a huge change in how we think about doing business. I think, for me, the way we get more money in capital flow is by shifting the system. By 2030, all finance will need to be green or transition aligned. It cannot be that we're still funding the capital pots of ESG and climate aligned finance. We need to move the massive pension pots and move funds like people like BlackRock and Elgin and Legal General, who've managed billions and billions of our money, to move all their schemes, not just a little bit of flipping around the edges. It has to be a mainstream transformation, and that will help capital flow in much larger volumes. And we're going to take some more risks on this. I mean, that's something I said to the Labour lawyers today, is we need to enable people to fail on this. We're not going to get every solution right. Some of this change involves trying a few things. We've learned that from how we move sectors on, and some of that will be that. I always think for SMEs, it is a challenge, because I think, especially having gone through COVID, trying to think back, they've survived. It's been a real difficult period for many small business owners. How do they now try and build out their model of starting a business again? But actually, we don't want to lock in the old behaviours. We've switched how we move. We've switched how we use energy. We've switched buildings that we've been in. We've all spent far too much root time in our homes for the last 18 months. So how do we take some of the energy savings, some of the carbon changes, and implement them going forward? On the social aspect, I think this is really key. And one of the big worries I have is the government's allergic reaction to a just transition in general. And I know that hard impact investment institute like has fought to get social co-benefits included in the Green Guild. I know it was a real tough battle, because the government really were pushing back against it. There's a lot of Tory backbenchers who probably a bit unconstructed, who, talks about seeds of socialism and inaction, and that's a good thing. So this is really tricky. And the reason it's so hard is because we understand, we barely understand how to measure carbon in scope 1, 2, and 3. You then try to add another layer of social metrics that vary per sector. So in this sector, it's important to reduce waste water. It's important to create jobs. They're different metrics. And I think this is something really important. We mustn't take our eye off the ball. Social needs to be in our mind. And in terms of disabled people, I think that's where the just transition and social aspects come in. You need to think about all communities that are impacted and what different impacts on them are.
So maybe you can pick up on the points of the investment in SMEs, but maybe reflect a bit more on that transition point, because again, it's not just investment in SMEs who currently wish to pursue green objectives. We have a huge problem of SMEs who are in high carbon sectors who actually we need to succeed and transition them into a new future. And how do we finance that?
I mean, on investment into sort of startup and in the renewable energy space, there are phenomenal impact investors out there. In fact, the Impact Investing Institute may have some suggestions for you. But for example, Al Gore's fund of Generation is, I think, investing in exactly the sort of thing that you mentioned. So you know, I don't doubt that there is capital out there. I don't have the unlock of the door for you. It's not what we do at Share Action to make that happen. But I do think that organisations like Generation might be the answer for what you're looking for. On just transitions, I mean, I again have to perhaps point to the EU and the way that it's leading its social taxonomy, and it becomes very wonkish very quickly when you start talking about the social taxonomy and the green taxonomy and the horizontal and the vertical dimensions of the social taxonomy and the way that these interlink with each other. But the point of it is, exactly as you were saying, Rishi, that you can't optimize for just one dimension. You can't solely look at something, an investment proposition or a company, about how it's performing on its environmental dimensions. You also have to consider the social impact of that. You have to have minimum standards on critical human rights issues, and you also have to reward impact where there's positive impact in different social dimensions. And it is tricky, as Rishi says, that there is, you know, in some ways, as tough as it is, climate change is actually the easy bit because it's one thing, basically. It's basically carbon. And so we basically got one metric and one measure. But the social dimension is so multifaceted. It's industry specific, it's geography specific. There are so many different impacted communities, as you mentioned. So I don't deny that it's incredibly challenging. How does that come to life? Well, let me reflect an example from our own campaign work at Share Action. So, like many organisations, our campaigns have developed based on themes. So we have a climate change campaign and we have a good work campaign, and they're separate. But they shouldn't be. They should be interlinked and interwoven, and we find them increasingly talking to each other and increasingly working together. And it comes to light in examples like, and it's controversial for many reasons, but a gig delivery company like Just Eat, for example. And so we've been working with investors to get Just Eat to address its climate impact, which for them means increasing use of electric vehicles and electric bikes. But if you then force your riders or drivers to pay extortionate amounts for those electric vehicles or electric bikes, you suddenly exclude people who previously derived incomes from it. So it took us a lot of thrashing out actually internally to work out what our position was and what we were really asking Just Eat to do, which was both balance the environmental impact that they were having and the potential negative impact that they could have on their workers. So it's not easy. It needs you to think of both of these dimensions in parallel, overlapping, and then actually talk through and think through what it means in practice on individual examples when it comes to light. I hope that's helpful.
So picking up one further, is this where the potential role of public investment does come in and support being structured into a broader partnership? Because I suppose one thing that I'm keen to understand is how do we understand whether we invest and back winners? That was certainly something that came out of the hydrogen, number of hydrogen discussions about actually understanding we're not looking investment into something that actually ultimately will not be coming through in time.
One of it is Simon said initially, the measuring as well. So I'll answer the second question first about our 2030 social. And a very straightforward question is making it mandatory, put it there from the beginning. So tidy, as you said, we have these 54 legacy commitments. We're part of our development consent order. We said we have to transport so much by river, so we don't have to have any trucks on the road. We had, with our contractors, we put in our contracts with our framework contractors a number of requirements in terms of employing apprentices, employing ex-offenders. And if they are there, the client pays for them. And we very have to pay, because it's very important for any big business. We need, it's called a social license to operate. We're spending 8 years building through 14 boroughs in London, bothering a lot of people. We need to have people on site. Just do something, but importantly as well, is then measuring it. And we've done a first study, we're now completing a second study with the social value of our investment. It's just a very short study on the value of the work we've done with expenditure. Each pound we invested, there's a social return of £6. And our overall social return on investment of all these different things we do is close to £4 return for each pound we invest. And we hope that next year we'll have the final study and we will publish it. We have to be bold. It has to be there from the beginning. It can't be an afterthought, because then it's too late. And contractors are taking margins that they can't pay for it. So the client has to pay for it, and the client has to be told. And we all, as pensioners, we all need to ask for it. As for the first question, I think, if I understood correctly, you're not talking about SMEs. You wanted 1, 2, 3 billion. You wanted scale. Obviously, to start small. I would. That's everything. One is Simon said, I think there's quite a lot of capital out there. You need to start a capital, angel investors. There's quite a few specialised in this area. But you talked about having this pension money invested. Rich needs the money back. And so you need to start with a business case that can justify that investment on a standalone basis. If you cannot, it's not a mortal sin, but then you need to look at different ways of investing. And one that we both talked about, but we need to look more about, is called blended finance, where some of the risk, like in our project, the catastrophic risk that I mentioned, was underwritten by the government. And we almost got rid of it. So that we paid anyway. So if you can't justify the version of standalone basis so that Rishi gets his money back, then we need to look at blended financing. And why not?
I agree with that. I mean, you asked the question, where should public money be targeted? And I agree. I think it's into blended finance, where and it's not in renewable energy. There's plenty of capital for renewable energy around. The challenges for renewable energy are in the regulation at the moment, and I was in a fascinating roundtable with the energy sector a couple of weeks ago, and just hearing from them about the length of time it takes to get consent for developing a renewable energy project. God knows how we're going to get the 40 gigawatts on stream by 2030 that we need. There's plenty of capital for it. But you mentioned cement. Cement, not that we have so much of it in this country, but chemicals, steel, to the extent that we still have steel as well. Those are used to be called the hard to abate industries. I don't like to call them that anymore because it's perfectly technologically possible to abate them, but it's not yet economically viable, and that's where public money should be invested through blended finance, as Dennis described.
If I may use actually, this is probably the point where Bridget would say this if she was here, so I will channel my inner shadow cabinet member. That's why Rachel announced £28 billion of funding each year, and the £3 billion they announced for helping the steel industry to transition. Because some of these things need a bit of subsidy to get them moving. And then we've seen this with onshore wind. Now onshore wind is highly competitive. The Tory backbenchers revolt and increase all of our bills. Onshore wind is now the cheapest form of energy. But people have campaigned against it to keep Tory backbenchers happy. And this is where you need some government subsidy to help move some of these markets, to help that subsidy emission down, and then rapidly remove it, because the sectors pop up and business will thrive eventually.
So, putting your local authority hat on, it was interesting when it said about the client. The client has to be clear and upfront at the start, and I've argued that on many a development. But the difficulty is, I know, that for the budget of many local authorities, if it's their land, the disposal of that land for as high a receipt as possible is written into their long-term financial plan. And so the consequence of austerity in many ways is that actually those who hold some of the assets aren't actually managing them in a future way because we're having to pay off debt. How do we balance?
Two things that we've done in the council, like to put a council hat on, because the pension fund sort of technically run at arm's length. At the council, we've amended our statutes to include as a part of our climate emergency declaration, and Birmingham have done the same. So embed that into every policy-making document. Now, has that fully happened yet? Not really. But every officer report has to now discuss the climate impact. So every decision needs to have that. And I would argue that it should be wider. It should probably be a sustainable development goals piece from the social points that Joe made earlier. I think on the pension fund, I've done this with every report now, has to have the SDG. How does this impact our positively, negatively, or why not? So every officer has to think about every report that comes to me, if it comes to our committee, of what the impact it's having, and that's how we start changing these decisions. And if climate emergency is declared by a number of, it feels very bizarre. There's not a climate emergency in Tory Barnet, but there is in Camden. So that boundary, it suddenly becomes not an emergency. This is where political leadership comes in.
Listen, Walsall made it in West Midlands. They don't believe there's been a climate problem. So, Okay, colleagues, more points. There must be points from the floor. Surely. You're not going to make me. Thank you. I think you guys have to work really hard there.
I don't know if this is the right forum to raise it. Sorry. Hello. I don't know if this is the right forum to raise this, but I work for a mixed-use developer, and we're trying to be as sustainable as we can be. And one of the barriers that we come up to is insurance on some of the materials that we're seeking to use. So one example that is probably the easiest to explain is timber. We'd like to work with timber a lot more than cement, but insurance companies say timber is highly flammable, and that has to be taken even more seriously post-Grenfell. And it seems quite sort of a childish response, really, in terms of how far, we've come with making these materials not flammable, and it's just a barrier that we come up against quite a lot. How do we work with the insurance industry to be a bit more progressive, open-minded in relation to sustainable materials, so that we can finally make those materials, basically make it a more financially easier decision to use sustainable materials as part of our plans.
They're flooding in now, that's what I want.
It's a bit of a shameless plug, really, but you do that for more. I work for the Port of London Authority, and probably many of you won't have heard of it, but I think my point sort of echoes, which is about the interdependency of all the organisations. No one organisation can do it on their own. But I think, just to highlight what we're trying to do, is traditionally the Port of London Authority sat on its assets and waited for a rainy day. They're not massive assets, but what we have been doing in London is specifically investing those assets to buy new walls, which have been protected by local authorities, for years, but actually turn those walls into a catalyst for more freight on the river, assisted by our colleagues in Thailand, who have shown that it can be done. And the air quality implications of more boats on the River Thames in part of London is just, in itself, small, but massive, because it sets an incentive for companies to actually think, well, we could do that, not just because it's good PR, but because it's right. And because the deliveries to guys at St Thomas's are now coming in by river. And that one action, which is a pilot, is an incentive to all logistics firms around the country to say, oh, well, we could do that. Sainsbury's could do that. They've got 10 years ago, Sainsbury's wouldn't have looked at the river, but because they had all their big stores, they've now got their local stores, and suddenly they think, we could do that. And again, it's a time way of doing it. So why, you can take spoil by river, why can't you take milk by river, or whatever non-perishable goods? And I just think it's a question of getting that's not the right phrase, but it's not the perfect storm, but it's a perfect combination of getting all the factors in place at the right time.
I think, and again, picking up on the colleagues point there, and then really extending it out to just a further point I'd be interested to explore, is that one thing I sometimes feel is that the river was there, it was an asset, but quite often what you find in local government is companies come in and sell a new product, and too often they don't look at the assets you already hold and how you can harvest those. But one of my concerns is that actually in many of our local authorities, whether there is actually the capacity or capability to actually do some of that strategic brokerage. So we have core key blockages, insurance, and risk adversity. We have the importance of the interdependencies and maximising what we've got. And my point, have we actually got the people in the right place doing the right things to try and make some of this happening so that the tideway model can be replicated elsewhere? Let's talk more, do. Let's talk.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just pick up on the real estate and insurance points, which actually bring together two really hot topics for us right now. You know, if we take the finance lens on thinking about how is the investment system decarbonising industry and our entire economy, as Rishi said, and real estate is a real blind spot for investors right now. We sometimes, you know, we research and publish reports on a range of different topics, and sometimes it's really interesting which ones fly off the shelves and which ones sort of flop. And real estate has been a real hot topic, and so I think investors are waking up to it, but mostly because they don't have a clue what needs to happen in order to decarbonise real estate. Given the sort of asset lifetimes involved and the timelines on which we need to reach net zero, there needs to be urgent action. We're just starting to get investors into thinking about that. The other, and you know, given that we're talking about pension funds as well, and about the pension, real estate is obviously an ideal asset for pension funds to hold as well. It's something, again, which pension funds can really be a driver for change all the way through the investment value chain. And in insurers is almost exactly the same. So we benchmark different sectors within, or parts or actors within the investment system, typically benchmark asset managers. Increasingly, we've been looking at banks and the roles that they play in their lending, and insurers have just come onto our radar. And there is, I can't believe I'm saying this, given how much it impacts them, but insurers are asleep at the wheel on climate change. And you know, both in their investment approaches, how they invest their assets, most of them don't have climate change policies in the way they invest. And then in terms of the way that they manage their insuring book, really patchy. It's not subject to nearly enough scrutiny, and there needs to be a ton more poured on it. Anything that anybody in this room can do to put the spotlight on the insurance industry, I think, is much needed. And I take your point away about the timber. I hadn't thought about it, but I'd like to keep that in.
We talked to the Green Construction Council.
Yes, we work closely with them.
Yeah, because I would imagine they would be a good place to start this.
Yeah, we're members of the UK Green Building Council.
Right, it's amazing what they do with timber.
Yeah, we're talking to the UK Green Building Council about it. It just seems like such an obvious problem that you would have thought would have been solved a while ago. It just keeps coming up.
Yeah, I think some sectors have been quicker than others, and I think insurance is lagging behind it, so that they will catch up.
I think both points sort of really come back to the fact that what we really, really need is a whole-scale green industrial revolution across everything we do. Climate has to be front and foremost of every decision, in every investment, in everything we do across the council space and public and private sectors. And we really need to shift and accelerate this thinking. As Ida said, there's time for deeds, not words, and this is really, really a problem. The government's very good at flashy announcements. They all look wonderful, lovely press releases and whatnot. There's a press release in the middle of climate, and then the equivalents on the corporate world. How do we cut through the crap and actually understand what's actually happening and drive real change to the underlying economy? And we as councillors and people and responsibility of councils can drive that in local government. But actually, it is really hard without the officers. 10 years, 11 years of austerity have meant that we don't have as many officers who can do some of these things. But actually, we can't be building buildings that are not fit for net zero. We have to be taking drastic action. And instead, the government's delaying its small buildings, clean buildings, and warm homes policies. We need to decarbonise 20+ million homes. How on earth, if we don't start now, the time gets shorter and shorter. 2030 is not coming any closer. It's not going to rapidly through.
You need the partnerships that make from the Port of London Authority.
Yeah.
And the Port of London Authority has done great work in these partnerships. The deliveries now use a lot more. And we wouldn't have done it, we traveled freight traffic on Ring 10, we wouldn't have done it without the Port of London Authority.
So what was the key driver? What made the Port of London act when it did?
I think there was it's our job to be custodian of the river and champion it in every possible way, socially, economically, recreationally.
But
But it was only, it was just the networks, it was all those people being, because just, I mean, the personal point is, I used to work on the tideway, and there was, a bit sort of, just like rules and all the rest of it, but from the right, tideway was attacked as being EU legislation gone back, from the left, it was attacked as fat cats, making money for fat cats. It can't be both. And it only happens by people putting politics aside and making it happen. And that's true for people like, Justine Greening and Putney to these inhabitants and others who actually challenge their constituents to say it's the right thing to do. It wasn't popular, but they did it.
Especially infrastructure, we have an obligation in our development consent order to try and transport so much from river. Infrastructure wasn't there. There were not enough train pilots, there were no barges, there were not enough cars. So then needed an investment. So the Port of London Authority in Tideway started an academy to train 300 pilots.
Yeah, exactly.
When we're gone, that infrastructure stays on the river.
And none of it is happening without that skills long term. And that's the other dimension. It is actually about people.
So, from what you're saying, and again, it's a pattern that's running through all of these sort of discussions around table, the importance of that kind of brokerage, bringing together this sort of range of interests, but then equally the point that comes across is actually measuring, actually understanding what you're doing, where your money's going, and what the outputs and impact is. Because again, that's one of my concerns, that we can invest in something that feels very sexy and looks great for a leader of a council to go out and say, I've got this, and I'm there with his hard hat on. But actually the carbon thing is minimal. And it's how we understand collectively where to put our money. I think it's one of the challenges. Colleagues, final few points. Nothing from the floor? So, if I was to ask the panel, so I'm going to ask each panel, and then I'm going to invite James to come in and co-chair, Sarah. If you could ask for one thing, if you had a magic wand, if I sat here as your fairy godmother, what would you really, really want to happen in the next year, 5 years, say, in terms of the investment?
Of course, the Labour government that would have able to support this. Because if I'm honest, I'm just fed up with dilly-dallying. On climate change, we have to work together. We need to build a political consensus, like Ed and did with Climate Change Act in 2008. It needed to be cross-party support, and on climate, we do need to collaborate to win together. But I mean, it's just too slow. Everything is too slow. The sense of emergency, the sense of urgency is just not there in this government. Everything is about pretty pictures and photo opportunities, and we really need people who are going to take hard action. Some of these decisions are not going to be easy. There are, this is why we need to think about just transition and impacts on communities. We really need to think about that first. So, a Labour government ASAP.
Okay, we heard in this room last night from a young person who was actually saying about how they feel their future is slipping away because we're not acting soon enough. I'm your fairy godmother. What would you like?
Well,
you can say a Labour government as well.
Okay. In the absence of a Labour government, I mean, we all can take action to change the finance system. We've all got a voice through our savings, whether it might be a pension or whether it might be some private savings you have. You can ask your provider what the environmental impact of that investment is and what their policies are, and challenge them on it. We have resources on our website should you wish to do that. And you can also get more involved personally in some of our campaigns if you wish. We train volunteers and give them shares in companies to go ask questions at company AGMs. We file shareholder resolutions at big banks, potentially insurance companies too. You give me an idea now. You can buy a share. It typically costs about £3, depending on the company in question. We bring everybody together and then we file a shareholder resolution. So in absence of a government that will drive this transformation, we can all take action to transform the finance system. That's my wish.
The power of the collective coming together for the common purpose.
Yeah.
I like that one.
Well, well, get into the finance system if you work at it.
Well,
I'm going to go a bit from a different angle. It's too much about carbon. It's important, it's fundamental. We had 20 years to solve for carbon. We had about 5 years to solve for biodiversity and natural capital. And so my wish is that natural capital, biodiversity, and the social aspects that it brings become centre stage in the same way that carbon is today.
it's a good shout.
That's a really good shout.
I can't believe we've got here without talking about that.
But again, I will have to work with what I get back time and time again from local authorities is we can invest in our natural capital, but we don't benefit from it. And it's again, it's that understanding that broader return. And we're almost going back to, there was thinking around the total place and total investment, and that's the kind of areas we need to look at. I would like to thank the panel for their contributions. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out and braving the rain to get here. And obviously we're going to be pushing you back out into the rain in a minute. I think I said at the beginning that this was the last of the SERA fringe events. And I think our co-chair, Jake, who has done an incredible job, I will say that now before he comes on, along with our fellow chair, Melanie, including together. But Jake, final words over to you.
Yeah, sorry, I won't detain everyone very long, but I also wanted to give some thanks to our organising staff as well. They've done a really tremendous job and worked tirelessly. It's an enormous job, and just realising the enormity of this that's just finished, to put all this together, it does take a lot of time and effort. So I'd like to thank Tracy and George, and also Alex, who's been doing all the filming for us as well. So thank you for them, for our staff, for thanking you for coming as well. And I hope we come back next year and we'll do more events like this, and we can keep doing during the year. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Keep the conversation going and join SERA if you want to be part of it. And let's give a round of applause to all of the organisers and ourselves.